Julie Kelly now joins us. Her Substack is declassified. You should go check it out on Substack. Become a subscriber, like Clay and I are. Julie, thanks for being here. Break it down for us. What does this latest motion from the Trump attorneys mean for the overall architecture of January 6 cases and some of the defendants who have even already been found guilty?
So this is related to the very encouraging news today that the Supreme Court will take up a challenge to the Department of Justice's use of 1512C2, obstruction of an official proceeding. This was a statute passed after the Enron Arthur Andersen accounting scandal that sort of closed a loophole related to the destruction or tampering with witnesses or evidence. You might recall the shredding of documents in that case. Well, what DOJ has done in January 6th is weaponize that statute to criminalize political dissent. You have more than 320 January 6th defendants who have been charged with this felony, punishable by up to 20 years in prison. This also represents half of Jack Smith's criminal indictment against Donald Trump. 2 of the 4 counts are directly 1512C2 related. So the notion, the idea that the Supreme Court picked up what was called really a muddy, splintered ruling by the appellate court that upheld DOJ's use of this statute, the fact that the Supreme Court came back, as many have predicted, and they will have to evaluate how the DOJ intentionally misinterpreted the language in that statute to use it as a felony charge against so many Americans for J6 and now Jack Smith. The repercussions here are huge, not just for Donald Trump, which we can sort of talk about the timeline in this collision course, but people who have already spent years in prison for convictions or plea deals on this. You have at least one man, Matthew Perna, who hung himself in February of 2022 after he was told the DOJ was going to seek years in prison after he pleaded guilty to 1512C2. The human wreckage left behind in this Department of Justice, Merrick Garland and Matthew Graves, the D.C. U.S. Attorney, bastardizing this statute to punish people and destroy the lives of those who protested Joe Biden's election. This will go down in history, legal history, as one of the worst abuses of power by DOJ and at least 15 judges on the D.C. District Court who refused to dismiss this count, even though they knew DOJ was misusing it.
Julie, you've done great work on all this, and I want to give you credit. I think you came on with us months ago and raised this as, hey, this is a looming issue for the Jack Smith prosecution. So I want to focus on the Donald Trump aspect, but also want to reiterate over 300 people have been convicted using this statute, right? So if the Supreme Court charged, okay, if the Supreme Court looks at this, am I correct before I dive into Trump that Graves, after this ruling and as the appeals have been going on, has stopped trying to charge people with this offense and prosecute because he's been worried about how it's going to be held up by the courts?
Correct. So Matthew Graves is a D.C. U.S. Attorney, Biden appointee, still rounding up and arresting people every day, including today. But once this appellate ruling came down in April, which really resulted in 3 different opinions. Yep. So by law, then it has to go to the Supreme Court for clarification. But since then, Matthew Graves has basically stopped using that felony count against J6ers. He switched it out to civil disorder felony because they know that now that this appellate court ruling was so muddled and it was then presented to the Supreme Court, and everyone has expected the Supreme Court to pick this up, even Democratic judges who have allowed this count to go forward. They knew this was coming. So the mere fact that Matthew Graves has stopped using that count is very telling. But more so, it shows the arrogance of Jack Smith, who included these 2 counts in the 4-count indictment against Trump in August.
Okay, so that's where I want to go to. I'm looking at this now, Julie, and saying I don't see any way possible this trial starts on March 4th. Because half of the charges that Jack Smith is now trying to bring against Donald Trump may get thrown out by the Supreme Court. I could see potentially Jack Smith trying to prosecute only 2 of the 4 charges now, or having to acknowledge that he has to wait to see if he can still bring all 4. Do you agree with me that March 4th feels out the window? What happens now?
Absolutely. This is just another nail in the coffin for this rushed March 4th trial date in Washington related to the events of January 6th. Of course, we already see what he did this week, a desperate attempt to leapfrog the appellate court, force the Supreme Court to weigh in on this presidential immunity claim made by Donald Trump, that he is immune from prosecution based on being the president, that we don't criminally indict presidents, especially after they leave office. And he had already been impeached, which is basically the criminal justice process in Congress. So aside from that, that's very uncertain as well. But I feel like this is even more important because this issue could be resolved sooner than the executive and presidential immunity issue. SCOTUS could refuse to take up this emergency order by Jack Smith, kick it back to the appellate court, and that could take weeks or months before they come to a conclusion. But in this case, we know for sure the Supreme Court is taking it up. Oral arguments, I'm told by my sources, could happen in March or April. This is when Trump is supposed to be on trial for this very count. And then in June, the Supreme Court would issue their ruling, presumably a very strong opinion vacating this appellate court ruling and interpreting the statute the right way. That could be, let's say that the March 4th date sticks. He's convicted of 1512C2 and the other 1512 count. And in June, Judge Sexton is supposed to be sentencing him, but the Supreme Court comes back and overturns DOJ's use of it. I mean, this is the sort of collision course we're talking about. So what is Jack Smith going to do now? Will he drop those two counts and supersede, which we've talked about, I think, for over a year, add a superseding indictment that adds different charges so he can cover his bases? Or will he go back to the court? I'm sure Trump's lawyers are working on this. I've already seen at least one J6 defendant today ask for a delay in sentencing on this count. Will Jack Smith go back and tell the court, we need to put this on hold because of the uncertainty of this count? I doubt it, but these are the open-ended questions that we're dealing with right now.
Speaking of Julie Kelly, her Substack is declassified. Go subscribe to it. I mean, Julie, do you feel like, I'm just wondering, I know this isn't the most specific legal analysis, but the Democrat system or the apparatus is just going to refuse to allow Trump to get through all of this, meaning it's either all delayed or on a... Do you know what I'm saying? Like, is there some other thing that you can see looming in the background here, or is it really possible that Trump might end up not even facing either of these federal trials before the people cast their vote? Like, how do you see this playing out?
It's such a good question because we also have the May 20 trial date that's still sort of sitting out there for the classified documents case. Now, in that situation, we have Judge Aileen Cannon, who has been very tough on DOJ, and she actually suspended all the pretrial deadlines leading up to that May 20th trial date. She confronted Jack Smith's team. I was in the courtroom saying, you can't assure me that the March 4th trial for Donald Trump is going to be completed by the time he is expected to be here in Florida on May 20th for this indictment. You chose to bring these indictments back to back. You knew they were going to be in different venues, so she's already kind of called them on the carpet. So let's even imagine that the judge or Jack Smith, or because of the Supreme Court, they kicked this Washington January 6th trial to what, April, May? The classified documents trial will be gone then. It will be after the election. There's no way that they can move forward with that. But do they have the hubris, the arrogance, the bloodlust to just keep pushing this no matter what? They do. I will tell you that they do. They will go to any extreme possible to make sure that Donald Trump is on trial this spring and to get a conviction. But it certainly has other ramifications. And at what point, what's the breaking point? You guys, at what point do any Democrats or legal organizations or anyone say, this is enough. You've pushed this as far as you can go. Now you're going into headwinds at the highest court in the land. Like, what are you doing this for? So,
crazy people do crazy things, Julie.
Yeah, but even with this case, I mean, they could not release an opinion until June, which would mean you couldn't start till probably, you're going to have to sit for the jury. I mean, increasingly, I don't see any way even that this trial happens. Julie, you're doing great work. Keep us updated. Have a great Christmas, and I'm sure be talking to you in the new year.
Yes, thank you guys so much for covering all my work. So grateful. Thank you. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, Julie.
She has done fantastic work.